It was late March, not quite the time most people think about camping in Central Florida, but that was the point. The snowbirds were still thick in the parks and the campgrounds near the springs, but I wasn't looking for a picnic table and a fire ring. I wanted quiet, something tucked away enough that no one would bother me. I'd finished a tough week out in the field surveying wetlands north of Tampa. That week, I'd nearly dropped from the heat one afternoon after hauling gear a half-mile into an oak hammock. I'd had to call out on my in-reach to get a coworker to come help me stagger back. A stupid misjudgment, but it happens. I decided to spend a solo night out in the scrub just to reset. I parked my vehicle in a pull-off off a barely used fire road in a management area near Kissimmee. The road was rutted and old, sandy in places where you could bury a tire if you got careless. I'd scouted it during work a couple months earlier. No gate, no signage to ward off folks, and most people avoided it because it didn't go anywhere anymore. It used to be a hunting camp access point, but the state had let it overgrow. Just over 2 miles in, there was a dry knoll with palmetto scrub all around. Not a sound out there, just wind and maybe the odd barred owl later on. I parked with the front end facing out in case I needed to leave fast. I turned my dash cam to face the driver's side and set the motion sensor to kick on recording if anything got too close. It wouldn't pick up much at night, but it might give a timestamp or a silhouette. The backup cam I'd bought last year, a cheap wireless one, was clipped inside my truck canopy window, pointed at my tent site. A small comfort. I set up about 20 feet away, just inside a patch of saw palmetto and scrub oak where it would be hard to spot the tent from the road. I laid a tripwire at knee height on the south side, the only opening in the brush I hadn't blocked. I used a fishing line strung through some fallen branches and clipped a little bell to it. My tent was a small dome. I kept everything tight, just what I needed. Sleeping bag, headlamp, in-reach clip to the side pocket, pistol in its sticky holster inside my sports bra, pepper spray on my right, fixed blade knife on the left. My machete laid flat near my sleeping pad. I had the scream alarm hooked to my jacket's waist loop. I placed my gator hunting light on a small plastic crate at my side, bright enough to blind someone if I hit them full force in the eyes. My boots were next to me, but I had a pair of black slip-ons for fast exits. I left a second folding chair and a set of men's work boots by the fire ring. Just a little psychological trick. I'd seen someone walk past my site once and turn around when they spotted 2 chairs. I don't sleep well the first night out solo, not really. Too many what-ifs and little pricks of silence that my brain tries to fill in. That night, I didn't even bother with the fire. Just heated up some rice and beans on my camp stove, ate sitting on the cooler, and stowed everything but my gear back in the truck. I was in the tent by 9:30, headlamp turned to red light. I kept it on my head while I lay down, back propped against my pack, reading a printout of a field manual for wetland indicator species. It was something to do until my body gave in. At 11:15, the bell on the tripwire gave a single jingle. One chime. I didn't move at first. I just froze. One sound doesn't mean anything. Wind, maybe. A raccoon. But I knew that bell. It wasn't loud. It wouldn't ring unless it was hit. It had never made a sound on its own, even in wind. I clicked my red light off. Pitch black now. I could hear my breath, shallow and slow. I pulled the gator light close, but didn't turn it on. Slid my right hand down to rest on the pepper spray canister, my fingers around the base. My other hand found the scream alarm line and gave it a tiny tug to make sure it wasn't tangled. I felt the cold, smooth shape of the knife's hilt just next to it. My pistol was snug and unmoving in my bra, warm against my chest. I listened. A crunch. Just one. Dry palm fronds or old pine needles being stepped on. A heavy step, maybe 20 or 30 feet to the south, from the direction of the wire. I didn't yell. I didn't make a sound. I didn't want to give up my position. Instead, I reached for the gator light switch. Then another step. Closer. Heavier. Too heavy for a raccoon. Too slow for a deer. It wasn't a pig. They're louder, Messier. This was deliberate. Walking. I flipped on the gator light and aimed through the mesh panel of the tent. White-hot light hit the palmettos. They glowed like snow. For a second, I couldn't see anything. Then a shape. A man. Human shape. standing dead still between two scrub oaks, maybe 6 feet tall. He wasn't close enough to make out a face, and he hadn't moved once the light hit him. Just stood there. He didn't raise a hand, didn't speak, just stood. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I was waiting for movement, toward me, away, sideways. Anything. Nothing. I sat frozen like that for maybe 30 seconds. Felt like hours. Then he turned. Not fast, not slow. Just turned around and walked back toward the road. I didn't hear a vehicle. Not before, not after. I kept the light on that spot for several minutes. Nothing came back into view. No movement. No sound. My arms started to shake from holding the light steady, but I kept it up. Eventually, I turned it off and waited in the dark, my ears doing the work. I didn't sleep. I didn't even unzip the tent. Just stayed fully dressed, boots on, light in hand, pepper spray between my knees. 3:04 a.m., I heard a sound again. Not from the south this time, from the east. Behind me, where there'd been no wire, a dragging sound, dry leaves, a long sweep like something being pulled or something crawling. I pulled the scream alarm's pin and let it shriek while turning the gator light on and aiming it in a full arc, swinging it from right to left in fast bursts. Nothing. I hit my inReach and sent a custom message to my emergency contact. Noise. Movement. Not animal. Not safe. Leaving. No one responded, of course. Takes time to send and return. That's the thing with satellites. I unzipped the tent fast, pulled the flap aside, and scanned again with the light. No shape, no footsteps, but I could smell something faint, sour, like sweat and mildew. Person smell. I didn't pack up, just grabbed my keys, inReach, pistol already on me, climbed into the truck, and locked the doors. I left the chair, the tent, the pack. I backed out in one long, slow reverse with the high beams on. I didn't even air down. Let the tires crunch and pop all the way out of that rut-ridden trail. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station off 441. I parked under the brightest lights and waited. It took 23 minutes for my contact to respond via inReach. Just heard. Tracking. Are you safe? I was, at least safe enough. No one had followed. I hadn't seen lights, no vehicle in the rear view, but something had been out there. The next morning, I went back with a buddy from work and a wildlife officer we knew. It was unofficial, just a check. We found my tent still there, untouched. Tripwire was down on the south side, snapped clean. No boot prints we could see clearly, but someone had stepped heavy in the leaves. Not a deer, not a hog, no tracks leading out either, just scuffed soil between palmettos. We never found a trail cam, never found a vehicle track. Whoever it was, they were on foot or very smart, or both. I never solo camped at that site again. I still go out alone sometimes, but I'm even more careful now. I put up 2 tripwires. I angle the backup cam wider. I mount a second scream alarm to the tent flap. And I always go with everything laid out in reach. Because the only thing that stood between me and something terrible that night was preparation and light. And that man, if it was a man, didn't expect me to be ready. But I was, and I still am. It was April 2013, and we were 2 days out from Weekend, one of the big festival. Back then, it was just something we did every year. Save up, pack light, and take those 4 or 5 days to completely check out of real life and dive into the heat, music, and chaos of Coachella. I was 26 that year, living in San Diego, working some low-stakes job that didn't care if I vanished for half a week. I'd been to Coachella a few times before, never VIP, never glamping, always car camping. It was kind of the point. If you were gonna do it, you had to do it full on. Dust in your eyes, warm beer, maybe a sunburn, maybe some regrettable choices, but you'd come back with memories, or stories at the very least. Our group that year was solid. For cars, about 11 of us total, a mix of close friends and friends of friends. We coordinated early and rolled out just past 9 a.m. that Thursday morning, all in a caravan with ridiculous decals slapped on the windows. Random inside jokes and dumb phrases so we could spot each other in the sea of cars. The drive out to Indio was uneventful, the way you hope it is. Long stretches of dry highway, bad gas station food, lots of water, and group texts flying back and forth even though we were barely out of sight from each other. We hit the camping line around 12:30 p.m. and got through in pretty good time. Every year was a crapshoot, but we lucked out with a solid spot. Close enough to the main path, but not so close that we'd be in a constant parade of foot traffic. We had a decent view of the mountains and not too far from the bathroom trailers, which was honestly the best case scenario. We cracked open beers as soon as we got the last tent stake in the ground and started unfolding canopies like our lives depended on it. The sun was already cooking everything by mid-afternoon, and we knew if we didn't get some shade up fast, we'd be dead before the music even started. That's when I heard them, the neighbors. Across from our setup, a group of 4 guys, probably mid-20s, maybe a little younger. You could hear them before you saw them. Loud Aussie accents, shouting over each other with the kind of energy you only really get when you're still running on adrenaline from a long flight and the fact that you're finally here. They pulled up a couple spots away from us, in one beat-up silver rental SUV with a busted front panel. You could tell they had zero idea how to camp, like this was a totally foreign concept to them. They had one cheap nylon tent still in the package, no canopy, and a massive speaker that looked like it belonged in a frat house, not a campground. Not a single one of them was wearing sunscreen. That was the first red flag. And then it happened. That speaker came to life, full volume, and I heard that first deep synthy bass line. Sometimes you're better off dead / there's a gun in your hand and it's pointing at your head. I didn't even have to turn my head to know what it was. Pet Shop Boys, West End Girls. They were dancing while setting up their sad little camp, just living in that moment and blasting the track like it was the anthem of the entire weekend. It made me smile at first. It was charming in that stupid way new festival campers can be when they're full of joy and not yet crushed by dehydration or heat stroke or heartbreak. I figured maybe it was just the first track they'd picked to kick things off, but it kept playing, again, and again, and again. It wasn't literally on repeat. That would have almost made more sense, but they kept manually going back to it. Like every 3rd or 4th song, one of them would grab the phone or the speaker and throw West End Girls back on like it was their personal theme music. Sometimes they shouted the lyrics, sometimes they just swayed with beers in hand. They weren't bothering me, yet, just hype dudes who probably planned their whole trip around the Pet Shop Boys set that Sunday night. The sun dipped down and the desert started to cool, just a little. Our group settled into that golden hour vibe. Folding chairs in a circle, drinks flowing, snacks passed around, phones charging via solar banks. We were tired but wired, that first night festival buzz setting in. You feel like anything's possible, like this weekend is going to last forever and you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I turned in around midnight. A few of us did. It wasn't even about being tired, just pacing ourselves. And that's when it started to unravel. From inside my tent, I could still hear them. Those Aussies laughing, drinking, yelling out phrases I couldn't even make sense of. The music was still going strong, and yep, West End Girls came back. I thought maybe they'd run out of songs. Maybe they only had one playlist. Maybe this was all they brought. But no, they just kept choosing it. Like it was some kind of inside joke between the 4 of them that only they could understand. The shouting got louder, the music got louder. At one point, it felt like the bass was rattling through my sleeping pad. I put a pillow over my head and tried to will myself to sleep. It didn't work. At one point around 2:30 a.m., I heard something crash, something big. I peeked through my tent flap and saw one of them had tripped and fallen into their own tent. The tent was now partially collapsed, but they didn't care. They just left it like that and kept partying. Another guy was puking in the dirt next to the wheel of their SUV, and the others cheered him on. They were those neighbors. I must have fallen asleep sometime past 4:30 a.m. I remember seeing the sky start to lighten when my eyes finally shut. When I opened them again, the sun was already high and blasting heat straight through the nylon of my tent. My face was wet with sweat, and I could feel the throb of a dehydration headache creeping in. It was 8:07 a.m. I remember checking my phone and groaning out loud. I'd gotten maybe 3 hours of broken sleep at best. When I crawled out of my tent, I saw them, the Aussies, sprawled out on the wreckage of their own collapsed tent. All four of them passed out on top of it like someone had dropped mannequins onto a pile of trash. No shirts, no covers, no shade. Just lying there, mouths open, arms splayed out in awkward angles like they'd been blown over in a windstorm. One guy had a sunburn already setting in, angry red on his back. And then there was the glow stick. I didn't process it at first. I thought it was just lying on the ground near one of them. But no, it was in him. Not in, but like lodged halfway in his butt crack. He was fully naked, face down, and that glow stick was sticking out just far enough that it looked like some kind of weird party favor. I wasn't even shocked. I was just tired and mad and too hot to care. I went straight for the water cooler, poured half a gallon over my head, and sat under our canopy with a protein bar, trying not to stare. They didn't move for hours. The rest of our group emerged in waves, and we all shared that same exhausted look. We'd all heard it. None of us had slept. We didn't even need to say anything. It was just a collective vibe of quiet, simmering frustration. We tried to recover as best we could. Took turns in the showers, rehydrated with electrolyte packets, tried to salvage day one before it really got started. Sometime around 3 p.m., I went back to the campsite to grab my jacket. The heat had peaked and was starting to let up a little, and the first acts were about to go on. I figured I'd rally once I changed into something lighter. That's when I saw them again. The Aussies. They were all sitting in their camp, if you could still call it that. The tent was still collapsed. Their chairs were janky and dusty. Beer cans were scattered in the gravel. They looked wrecked, not in a funny, haha kind of way, but in that wide-eyed, sun-fried, mouth-dry, post-apocalyptic haze kind of way. They didn't say anything. They barely moved. One guy held his head like he was trying to keep his skull from falling apart. Another had wrapped a towel around himself like a sad little cloak. The glow stick was gone, thankfully, but the silence was deafening. I didn't even feel bad. They'd earned it. That night, after the music ended and we made the long, foot-dragging walk back to the campsite, something amazing happened. We cracked open more drinks, turned on our speaker, and played music. Not too loud, but just enough. We laughed, we shouted, we cheered the start of the weekend. And as I glanced across the way, I saw them again, those 4 Australian guys, sitting in silence. One of them shuffled over at one point, tried to ask us if we could keep it down. He didn't even finish the sentence before one of our guys laughed out loud and handed him a beer. They didn't party that night. They didn't party much at all the next day either. They eventually made it into the venue Saturday afternoon. I caught a glimpse of them near one of the shaded beer gardens. They were more subdued, still smiling, still moving to the music, but definitely not bringing the chaos. I think they learned their lesson. Sunday night, the Pet Shop Boys closed the weekend on the main stage. I stood near the back with 2 of my friends, swaying to West End Girls, and when that synth kicked in, I laughed out loud. Somewhere in that crowd, I knew they were there, probably living their best life. But I couldn't help but think about that first night. The volume, the glow stick, the broken tent, the payback. It was a brutal way to start the weekend. But that's the thing about Coachella. Sometimes the worst moments make the best stories. And for what it's worth, I still like that song. But only once, maybe twice, never more than 3 times. It was early May 2022 when I decided to go on my first real solo backpacking trip in the Sierra Nevada in California. I'd always wanted to hike Mount Whitney, but the permits were hard to get, and I figured I'd start smaller with a 2-day trip to Mount Langley. The trail was supposed to be beautiful, a climb that rewarded hikers with stunning views of the Owens Valley and surrounding peaks. The plan was simple: hike in, camp near the ridge, bag the peak the next morning, then head back down. 2 days, 1 night, a test of my gear and endurance. I was 28 then, not a newbie to camping, but never truly alone in the backcountry. I had done group trips before, family outings, but this was solo, just me, my pack, and the wilderness. The morning was crisp, with that fresh, pine-scented air you get just before the sun fully rises. I started on the trail around 7 a.m., moving steadily, my pack weighing about 30 pounds. The trail wound upward through tall pines and scattered patches of wildflowers, little bursts of yellow and purple in the undergrowth. Every so often, the trail would open up to reveal wide views of the valley below, a patchwork of dusty earth and shimmering lakes. About 2 miles into the climb, while I was catching my breath on a switchback, I noticed someone approaching from behind. A man, mid-30s maybe, jogged past me, his pace fast but controlled. I nodded, expecting him to keep going, but instead he slowed down and matched my pace. I felt a little uneasy but didn't want to be rude, so I let him walk alongside me. There was something about him that didn't sit right. His smile was a little too wide, his eyes too intense. He talked like he was trying too hard, like someone reciting lines from a script about hiking and adventure. He said things about how he loved pushing himself, how he was always chasing something harder, more thrilling. But he sounded tired. Not just physically tired, but like he was trying to convince himself of something he didn't believe. The whole time I kept my guard up. I thanked him for the company but was relieved when I decided to stop for lunch at a rocky overlook a few hundred feet ahead. He kept going without hesitation, and I thought that was the end of it. I took my time eating a peanut butter sandwich, some trail mix, and a cold bottle of water. The sun was warm on my skin, but the wind was sharp, tugging at the branches overhead. The valley stretched out below me, vast and quiet. It was one of those moments when you feel both small and part of something much bigger. After lunch, I pushed on, the trail getting steeper as I neared the ridge. The forest thinned out, replaced by scraggly junipers and rocks coated with lichen. I moved slower here, tired from the climb but driven by the thought of reaching my campsite before dark. Eventually, I found the perfect spot, a flat promontory just off the trail, overlooking the valley with a clear view to the east where the sun would rise. The ground was covered in a thin layer of pine needles, soft and dry. There was a single large pine nearby that would shield me from the worst of the wind. I set up my tent quickly, although I was really cowboy camping, meaning I just rolled out my sleeping pad and bag without the tent mesh. I liked it that way, the open sky, the stars, but it did leave me more exposed. As dusk fell, the forest grew quiet except for the occasional rustle of small animals. The temperature dropped sharply. I cooked a simple dinner, freeze-dried pasta, then settled in with my phone to listen to some podcasts to calm my nerves. The History of Rome podcast was a good distraction, something steady and familiar to keep my mind off the dark. But as night deepened, that uneasy feeling crept in. I kept thinking about the man from the morning, his smile, his strange intensity. My imagination started filling in gaps, and every little sound seemed amplified in the quiet forest. A branch snapping nearby made me jump. I heard distant footsteps on the trail, but when I peered out, there was no one. Shadows moved between the trees like ghosts. I was hyper-aware, scanning the edges of my vision for movement, gripping the fixed blade knife I kept beside me. The knife was small but sharp, my last line of defense if something went wrong. I checked it twice, feeling the cold steel against my skin, wishing I had brought bear spray or something louder than the quiet folding blade. Sleep eventually came, but my dreams were restless, filled with flashes of that man's face and the open pockets of my pack. I woke once or twice to check my gear, reassured by the quiet night but still anxious. Morning arrived with a pink sky and cold air. I was surprised to find that I had slept deeply, the kind of sleep you get when your body is truly tired but your mind is still wary. That's when I noticed the pack. I had left it leaned against the pine tree, within arm's reach. But every pocket was open, not just slightly but fully unzipped, unclipped, unwrapped. My sleeping bag compartment gaped open, the mesh organizers inside exposed. Even the small stuff sacks inside had their buckles undone. Nothing was missing, but everything was spread out like someone had gone through my belongings carefully, deliberately. I'm normally meticulous with my gear. I triple-check zippers and closures every time I pack up. I know how easy it is to lose things in the backcountry, and how important it is to keep everything tight. My heart dropped. I grabbed my knife from the ground. It was no longer secured to its sheath. The snap closure had been undone. Someone had been close enough to open my pack and check my gear while I was asleep, or at least while I thought I was alone. Panic surged through me. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Had that man followed me here? Was he still nearby, watching? I grabbed my pack, shoved my gear in haphazardly, and without wasting a second, I started packing up fast. I kept my knife in my hand, ready. The forest seemed darker somehow, heavier. Every noise was magnified. The crack of a twig, the flutter of a bird's wings, the rustle of wind in the pines. I moved as quickly as I dared, breaking down my sleeping pad and bag, stuffing everything into my pack. My heart hammered in my chest. I checked my phone, signal was weak but still there. I texted a quick message to a friend, telling them my location, but I knew I needed to move now. Without looking back, I started down the trail, my pace fast and steady. Every minute felt like an hour. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone emerging from the shadows, but the forest remained silent. The descent was harder than the climb. My legs were tired, my lungs burning, but I pushed on. I told myself to stay calm, keep focused, and not let fear take over. By the time I reached the trailhead several hours later, exhausted and drenched in sweat, I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. I'd been lucky. Someone had been close enough to touch my gear, close enough to mess with my things, but nothing worse happened. I never saw that man again. The experience stayed with me for months afterward, haunting my thoughts every time I planned another solo trip. It made me rethink my safety, my gear, and my instincts. I still love hiking and camping alone. That quiet connection with nature is hard to beat. But now, I'm hyper-aware of the people around me, and I never leave my pack or knife unsecured. The mountains are beautiful, but they're also unpredictable. And sometimes the scariest moments come not from the wilderness itself, but from the people who move through it. I remember that night like it was yesterday, clear in my mind with all the little details, every shadow and sound. It was September 2022, and we were camping at Green Pine Campground, a spot tucked deep in the northern woods of Vermont. I was 27 at the time, and the trip was supposed to be a chill weekend away from city noise, just me and 3 close friends, Kyle, Matt, and Jenna. We'd all worked hard over the summer and wanted a break before fall really kicked in. The campground had a few dozen sites scattered around a main dirt road, but some were empty and overgrown. Our site was on the far side near a small creek, which gave off this peaceful sound that filled the background. The woods were thick with pine and birch trees, and even though it was late September, the air was still warm enough to wear just a hoodie and jeans at night. The sky was perfectly clear, and I remember looking up and seeing stars I hadn't seen in years. Our tent was a decent-sized dome, set up near the back edge of the site, close to the trees. We'd arranged our sleeping bags inside and hung a string of battery-powered fairy lights around the opening to have some soft glow, but nothing that would light up the whole camp. The restrooms were about a quarter-mile down the main path, a small cluster of old wooden outhouses that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 80s. There was no electricity there, just moonlight and the occasional flash of a headlamp. That night, after a couple of beers and some snacks, the quiet settled in. We were all tired but not quite ready to sleep. Around 10 p.m., I felt that unmistakable pressure. I had to take a shit, the kind that builds up, uncomfortable and urgent, and you can't put it off. I told the others I was heading out to use the restrooms and grabbed my small flashlight. It was a basic LED, nothing fancy, but enough to light the ground in front of me as I stepped onto the path. The main dirt path was narrow and uneven, snaking through the trees. The forest was completely dark beyond the beam of my flashlight. I walked at a steady pace, trying not to hurry but wanting to get back before my friends thought I was lost. The quiet was thick. No crickets or frogs, just the faint rustle of wind moving through the leaves. After about 2 minutes, I noticed a figure up ahead on the path. At first, I thought it was one of the other campers, but then I saw the way he walked, slow, deliberate, a gait so peculiar I knew immediately it was Kyle. Kyle had a strange shuffle when he walked, like his right leg moved a bit more stiffly than his left, making a slight, uneven rhythm. It was hard to describe, but you'd recognize it if you'd seen it before. Kyle was coming out of a side path that led to an unused campsite about 50 yards from ours. That site looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Old rusted camping chairs, remnants of a fire pit cracked with age, and fallen branches littering the ground. I'd never seen anyone camp there during our stay, and the path leading there was narrow and overgrown with weeds. Kyle turned and looked back at me, maybe 40 feet ahead, and in his usual dry tone asked, "Why are you following me?" I laughed to myself, then called back, "I told you guys I'm going to the bathroom. Why are you coming from that old site anyway?" He just picked up his pace and kept walking faster along the main path. I kept my distance, feeling a little uneasy but trying not to read too much into it. At several points, Kyle would stop, turn his head sharply behind him as if to make sure I was still there, and ask the same question, "Why are you following me?" Each time I replied the same way, explaining I was on my way to the outhouse. But each time, he seemed to act like I was lying, like he thought I was sneaking up on him for some reason. The path ahead grew darker as the trees thickened. My flashlight flickered a bit, and I cursed under my breath for not bringing spare batteries. Kyle started to move quicker and disappeared into the blackness before I could catch up. I slowed down, feeling an odd mix of frustration and concern. Something felt off. I kept walking toward the restrooms, telling myself Kyle was probably just messing with me. When I finally reached the outhouse, I double-checked my flashlight and locked the door behind me. The smell was stale but expected. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight as I sat down, the faint sound of the forest outside faint through the thin walls. I took care of business quickly and washed my hands with the cold water from the jug we brought, then stepped outside to head back. The walk back was even darker. The moon had slipped behind a bank of clouds, and the air had cooled noticeably. My steps were slower, more cautious. About halfway back, I noticed movement near our campsite. Something or someone just beyond the edge of the tree line. Kyle was there, standing still just past the glow of our fairy lights, like he'd been waiting for me. I stopped, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "Why are you messing with me?" I asked quietly, though I knew he wouldn't answer. Back at the tent, I confronted the group. Everyone denied seeing Kyle leave or coming from the unused campsite path. They said he'd been sitting with them the entire time, joking around and drinking. But I'd just seen him. That strange walk, the way he kept turning and asking questions. It was him, no doubt. Kyle denied it too, said he never left the tent after dark. I was annoyed but didn't press it. Maybe it was some weird game, or maybe I was just imagining things after a few drinks. I went to bed feeling uneasy but shrugged it off. Around 3 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. The pressure wasn't urgent, but I didn't want to wait until morning. This time, I didn't feel like walking the quarter mile to the outhouses. The woods behind our campsite were thick but familiar, so I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out quietly. The night air was cold, sharp against my skin. I walked about 20 feet into the trees, looking for a good spot where I wouldn't be seen but could easily get back. As I finished, I heard the unmistakable sound of a tent zipper opening. My heart jumped. In the silence, the sound was sharp and sudden. I froze, flashlight still in hand. The zipper sound came from Kyle's tent. I turned toward it. The small LED lights we'd hung barely lit the area, but I could just make out the shape of someone moving inside. Then the zipper sound again, closing. My pulse sped up. As I got closer to the tents, I saw a faint glow. Kyle pulled out a lighter, flicking it a few times. The flame caught, illuminating his face in short bursts. He took a long drag from a cigarette, the ember glowing bright in the dark. He looked up, eyes squinting against the flame. "Can you hear me?" he said quietly. I replied, "Yeah, I hear you. What's up? Can you hear me?" He repeated, louder this time. "Yeah," I said, a little irritated. "You trying to wake everyone up?" Kyle shook his head slowly and turned away, heading toward the parking lot where our cars were parked. I figured he was messing with me again. I followed him, my flashlight bobbing in the darkness. He was about 30 feet ahead, walking steadily past the cars. Suddenly, he disappeared behind the biggest SUV. I turned the corner of the vehicle and found nothing. No sign of Kyle. My heart was pounding. I called out, but the woods swallowed my voice. I walked back toward the tents, anger bubbling under my skin. Kyle had to be playing some kind of game. This was beyond annoying. But when I got back, his tent was zipped up tight. I pressed my ear against the fabric, hearing faint, steady breathing. Kyle was definitely inside, asleep. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight and a pocket knife ready. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I asked the others if they'd noticed anything strange. They laughed, said I was imagining things or just tired and overthinking it. Kyle, of course, denied ever leaving his tent after the first night. But I knew what I saw. The thing is, I still don't know what to make of it. It looked like Kyle, sounded like Kyle, moved like Kyle, but I'm certain it wasn't him. Maybe someone else out there was wearing his clothes, walking the same way, imitating him for some reason. Or maybe it was Kyle himself playing a trick. But why would he deny it so completely, even when caught? I never felt threatened enough to leave that night, but those 2 moments, the strange walk in the dark and the disappearing act behind the cars, stuck with me. I haven't gone camping at Green Pine since. I've thought about telling Kyle to his face, but it's easier to let it go. Sometimes the woods play tricks on you, or maybe people do. Either way, I'll never forget those 2 things in one night, both involving the same friend, both when I just needed to go to the bathroom. I had spent the entire summer of 2020 living out of my old Jeep, a beaten-up but reliable 95 Cherokee I'd named Hazel. My plan was simple: explore British Columbia as much as I could before the weather turned cold. I'd converted the back into a cozy camper, a sleeping pad, a few shelves for supplies, a little camping stove, and all the essentials for solo travel. I'd covered over 5,000 kilometers by early fall, weaving through mountain passes, dipping into quiet valleys, and hopping from one provincial park to the next. It was late September now. Tourism had mostly died down, with few travelers left on the trails and in the campgrounds. Midweek, especially, it felt like I was the only person in half the parks. I preferred it that way. After a summer of people and noise, the silence of the wilderness in the shoulder season was a balm for my soul. That afternoon, after a few days camping near Wells Gray Provincial Park, I decided it was time to start heading south towards Vancouver Island. My route took me through smaller towns and winding dirt roads, places off the beaten path where cell service was spotty at best. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a fork on the map near 100 Mile House, and something caught my eye: a narrow dirt road leading to a small lake called Jackson Lake. It wasn't marked as a campground, just a spot on the map with a little patch of blue. I figured I'd drive down, find a quiet place to park, and spend the night there. The sun was still an hour away from setting, and I was exhausted from the week's hiking and driving. A simple night by the water sounded perfect. The road was rough but passable, and Hazel handled the bumps like a champ. When I finally rolled to a stop near the lake's edge, the world around me seemed to hold its breath. The trees were tall and thick, a mix of fir and spruce leaning over the water's edge, their reflections dark in the still lake. There was no one else around. The silence was profound. I set up my little campfire a few meters from the car, surrounded by smooth river stones I'd collected earlier. I built a modest fire that crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the air. I poured myself a glass of red wine, settled into my camp chair, and stared out over the water. The sunset was spectacular. The sky a deep orange, fading to dusky purple, streaked with wisps of clouds. I could hear the faint howl of wolves somewhere in the distance, their calls echoing through the valleys and hills beyond. The smell of pine and earth mingled with the smoke from the fire. I felt completely at peace. Out here, miles from the nearest town, away from roads and people, I was alone with nature and my thoughts. A rare bliss came over me, like a quiet warmth spreading through my chest. This was what I had chased all summer: solitude, freedom, and the raw beauty of the wilderness. But then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last light vanished, a sound broke the stillness. A low, distant hum that slowly grew louder. A car. My body stiffened instantly, Anxiety hit me like a wave, unexpected and heavy. My heart began to pound, each beat thudding painfully in my ears. For the first time in all my months on the road, alone in the wild, I felt genuinely afraid. The road I'd driven in on was a dead end. There was no other way in or out without backtracking miles. If a vehicle was coming here this late, it meant it would stop nearby, possibly right next to me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. Images flickered through my mind. A lone man in a beaten-up truck, maybe drunk or worse, someone who had been looking for trouble. The kind of person you read about in news stories, the kind you hope never crosses your path. I was in my early 30s, a solo woman in the middle of nowhere. My Jeep was my safe haven, but I'd left the windows down a crack to avoid condensation, and my campfire was glowing bright in the darkness. I quietly stood and crept to the back of Hazel, grabbing the small camping axe I always kept there for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I locked all the doors and crouched behind the shadowed side of the Jeep, away from the firelight. I wanted whoever was coming to think the place was empty. The humming grew louder. Soon, I could see headlights piercing the dark through the trees. The car's headlights moved carefully along the narrow dirt road, then slowed as it approached the small clearing where I was parked. I prayed they would just pass me by and leave, but the vehicle stopped right next to Hazel on the side opposite my campfire. A door opened. Footsteps hit the gravel. My breath caught in my throat. I clutched the axe tight enough to whiten my knuckles. For a moment, I froze, rooted to the spot. The instinct to fight, flee, or freeze overwhelmed me. I thought of running, but the forest around was thick, the ground uneven and strewn with roots and rocks. If I tried to run, I'd likely trip or twist an ankle. My mind raced, what if this person meant harm? What if they found me here, alone and vulnerable? Then a desperate plan formed. I slowly reached toward my driver's door, pulled it open, and then slammed it shut hard. The sound was loud, sharp, and masculine, just the kind of noise I hoped would make whoever was near think twice. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The car door slammed shut. Engine started. Headlights moved away, driving off down the road to the far side of the lake. I exhaled slowly, lowering the axe and turning back to the fire. I quickly doused it, smothering the embers with dirt until no glow remained. I climbed back inside Hazel, locking the doors again, heart still hammering. That night was the longest of my life. Couldn't sleep. Every creak and rustle outside made me jump. I kept waking, eyes wide, checking the locks. My ears strained for any noise beyond the natural sounds. The wind whispering through branches, the distant calls of animals. At one point, I woke to the sound of my door handle moving. Panic surged through me, a cold, paralyzing flood. I bolted upright, ready to fight or scream, only to realize it was a nightmare. Sweat drenched my skin, my breath ragged. I stayed curled up in the small camper space for hours, flashlight ready, axe within reach. Morning couldn't come soon enough. As the first light filtered through the trees, I packed up hastily, eager to leave that quiet lake behind. I never saw the mysterious visitor again, nor did I learn anything about who they were or why they came. Sometimes I wonder if my mind had exaggerated the danger, how fear can twist reality when you're alone and vulnerable. But I also believe that gut feelings are not to be ignored. They warn us for a reason. Since then, I never camp alone without letting someone know exactly where I am. I keep my emergency tools close, and I try to avoid stopping on dead-end roads after dark. That night at Jackson Lake stayed with me, a stark reminder that solitude in nature is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable, and that sometimes the wildest things lurking out there aren't animals or shadows, but other humans. I was 17 when I went to that camp in northern Wisconsin. It was the fall of 1998, and I was part of a Boy Scout troop that had planned a weekend camping trip at a place called Amar Indian Mound Reservation. Amar was not your typical campground. It was a patch of dense woods and rolling hills, with a handful of well-kept campsites scattered among old burial mounds left by Native American tribes who had lived there long before any of us ever set foot in those woods. The burial mounds were small earthworks, like gentle humps in the landscape, maybe 5 or 6 feet wide and 2 or 3 feet high, shaped roughly like elongated ovals or low ridges. They reminded me of the berms you'd see at a shooting range, except these had been there for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. The place had a quiet feel, almost reverent, like the forest itself was holding its breath in respect. At least that's what I thought before that night. Our troop had picked IMR because it was secluded, off the beaten path, and offered some great hiking and canoeing nearby. I remember the air was crisp and cold, the way it always is in northern Wisconsin come late September. The trees were just starting to turn, bright reds, yellows, and oranges, and the ground was covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves. The nights got chilly, and the dampness in the air made the fallen leaves feel slightly moist, so when you walked through them, the sound was a soft, muted crunch instead of the loud, dry crackle you get in a late autumn forest. I'd never been to IMR before. The troop leader told us to respect the area, to stay on the trails and avoid disturbing the mounds. It was a serious place, he said, not just another camping spot. I was excited but also a little nervous. I liked the woods, but there was something different about IMR that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first day was normal. We pitched tents, built campfires, cooked hot dogs and marshmallows, and went on a few hikes. The woods felt alive with color and quiet wildlife. I remember the smell of wet earth and pine needles mixed with campfire smoke. That evening, we sat around the fire until the stars came out. The sky was clear, and the Milky Way stretched like a faint silver river overhead. It was beautiful and peaceful. That night, I went to sleep early in my tent. My tent was a simple 2-person model green with a rainfly covering it. I was alone, my friends and the other scouts had tents nearby but not too close. The troop leader had told us to respect each other's space and keep noise to a minimum. The campsite was near one of the mounds, maybe 20 feet away. I could see its dark shape through the mesh window of my tent. The night was cold but not freezing. I was wrapped up in my sleeping bag, feeling snug and warm. The wind was soft, making the trees whisper gently. I was just drifting off when I heard it. Footsteps. First, it was faint, a slow, steady crunching sound of leaves being stepped on. It wasn't fast or hurried, just deliberate. The steps moved around my tent. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps weren't light or quick. They had weight to them, like someone dragging their feet through the damp leaves. I lay perfectly still. The tent walls rustled softly as the footsteps circled. They moved to the front door of my tent and paused. I could hear the slight drag of a boot or shoe on the wet earth. Then, after a brief stillness, the steps turned and circled the tent the other way. I didn't move. My heart was pounding, but my body was frozen. It was enough to keep me alert, but not so close or violent as to make me panic. It was strange. The footsteps didn't rush off. They didn't bang on the tent. They just walked around quietly, like someone was checking the place out. I lay there for what felt like minutes, maybe longer. I didn't know what to think. Was it another scout playing a prank? Had someone wandered into the wrong campsite? But there was no way anyone else was nearby. The troop leader had told us all to stay put after dark. And the campsite was pretty isolated. No trails, no roads close by, just dense woods. The footsteps stopped again, just in front of my tent's door. Then they stayed silent. I could feel a pressure in the air, a strange feeling I hadn't felt before. It wasn't fear exactly. It was like the difference between sensing a lost hiker wandering near camp and something else, something more intangible. It was like the forest was holding something in, a presence rather than a person. The footsteps slowly moved away, receding into the dark. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the forest sounds, waiting for any sign of movement. The next morning, I told my patrol leader what happened. He didn't dismiss it, but said it was probably an animal or someone walking around the site. No one else heard anything, and that night was quiet. But over the next 2 days, I kept thinking about those footsteps. The way they moved deliberately, the pause at my tent, and the strange feeling I had while listening. I began to notice the mounds more, how they were scattered around the site like quiet sentinels. There was no ghost or spirit. I knew that. I don't believe in that kind of thing. It was just a very real experience of being somewhere old and serious, where people had lived, died, and been buried centuries before. On the last night at camp, I didn't hear the footsteps again. I slept lightly but without interruption. I guess whoever or whatever had passed by my tent the first night was gone. What I took away from that trip was not fear of ghosts but a deep respect for the place. Amar was more than just a campsite. It was a reminder of history and the people who came before us. It taught me that sometimes the forest speaks quietly, through the sounds of footsteps, the shape of the land, and the weight of the silence. You don't need a story about spirits or monsters to feel that something important is there. That night, waking to those slow, dragging footsteps circling my tent was one of the most unsettling moments of my life. Not because I felt threatened, but because it made me realize how small and out of place I was in that ancient land. It was a humbling experience, and I've never forgotten it. Since then, whenever I camp near old burial sites or historic places, I listen more closely, tread lightly, and remember that some places carry the memory of time itself. And that's enough to make you sit quietly and watch the woods with respect. The summer of 2018, my friends and I decided to do something a little different. We were all in our late 20s. Me, Mark, and Jordan. And we'd been camping together since high school, mostly in the northern parts of California where the forests were thick and wild. But this time, we picked a spot in the Sierra National Forest, not far from a creek called Featherstone Creek. It was a quieter, less popular spot than usual. I had been there once before with my dad years ago, so I knew the terrain pretty well. The plan was a 3-day foraging camp, relying on what the forest had to offer with just a few backup MREs and the basics for shelter. We packed light but made sure to bring firearms for safety and hunting. The first day went smoothly. We hiked in about 5 miles carrying only what we needed to survive. The weather was perfect, mid-70s during the day, cooling to low 50s at night. The forest was alive with birdsong and the buzz of insects. We set up camp near a bend in the creek, a small clearing surrounded by tall firs and oaks. The ground was covered with pine needles and small rocks, and the creek made a soothing babbling sound nearby. Felt peaceful. After we set up, we spent the afternoon scouting for food. Mark managed to shoot a squirrel with his rifle, and Jordan found a spot where crawdads were hiding under rocks in the creek. We cooked the squirrel over a small fire and boiled the crawdads, eating them with some salt we'd brought along. Tasted like pure survival, fresh, earthy, and satisfying. We cracked open a few beers as the sun went down and talked about future trips before falling asleep under a clear sky full of stars. The second day started calm but changed fast. I woke up early, feeling a bit restless. The forest, which had seemed so vibrant yesterday, was eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the brush. Even the creek seemed to have lost some of its usual liveliness. It was the kind of silence that grabs at your skin and doesn't let go. Mark noticed it too, but brushed it off like I did at first. We decided to split up for a while and cover more ground. Mark and Jordan went upstream to a spot about 200 yards away, where they wanted to check some berry bushes Jordan had spotted on the map. I stayed back to keep the camp secure and keep an eye on the fire. I knew these woods better than anyone. I grew up around forests and learned early how to read signs. Snapped twigs, disturbed dirt, the way leaves flutter when something moves through the brush. But this felt different. It wasn't the usual signs of a bear or mountain lion. It was quieter, more deliberate, like something was watching, waiting. As the sun dipped below the trees, the shadows grew long and the cold crept in. I made the fire bigger, piling on dry wood to get a roaring blaze going. I grabbed my rifle, a scoped .30-06 that felt reassuringly heavy in my hands. The only problem was that Mark and Jordan had taken the only 2 flashlights with them, which was a stupid oversight. I had a small headlamp in my pack but hadn't brought it out. The woods around me were deepening into night, and then I started to hear it. Faint voices, not loud, just murmurs, barely above the whisper of the wind. They came from the opposite side of the creek from where Mark and Jordan had gone. They were too indistinct to make out words, but the tone was unsettling, low and urgent, like people talking quietly but with an edge of fear or aggression. My heart started pounding. I scanned the dark tree line with my scope, the orange flames casting flickering light on the nearest trunks. Then I saw something move about 50 yards out. It wasn't walking upright. It was on all fours, but the way it moved was strange. Quick, almost fluid, and its arms looked longer than they should be for any person I'd ever seen. It reminded me of an ape, but there were no apes in these parts. It had the shape of a human torso, but it crouched very low, like it was stalking. I held my breath and tracked it through the scope, but it vanished quickly, melting into the shadows of the forest. I kept the rifle trained where I last saw it for a while, heart hammering in my chest, but the creature didn't reappear. From that point on, the night got worse. I heard soft rustling all around camp, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, always on the side of the woods away from the creek where Mark and Jordan were. It felt like whatever had been out there was moving silently in a circle, watching me. Every time I swung my scope to scan the dark, the noise stopped. I stayed close to the fire, adding wood constantly, trying to keep the flames high and bright. I knew the forest could play tricks on you, especially when you're alone at night. But this wasn't my imagination. Something was out there. About 10 minutes later, Mark and Jordan came back. They looked tense. Their eyes darted nervously around the dark. They told me they'd heard the same whispers and noises where they were, and it freaked them out enough to cut their scouting short. We didn't speak much after that. We just sat around the fire, all of us taking turns watching the edges of the clearing. We set up 3 lookouts around the camp for the rest of the night. Nobody slept. I sat by the fire, gripping my rifle, watching shadows and listening to every sound. The forest stayed dead quiet except for occasional rustling, but we didn't see anything else. By dawn, the light filtered through the trees in pale ribbons, and I felt some relief. We packed up camp as fast as we could, the tension thick in the air. None of us wanted to stay a minute longer. The hike back felt longer than the way in. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the underbrush made me jump. When we finally reached the trailhead and my truck, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We never went back to that spot again. The next day, I thought about what we'd seen and heard. We talked it over quietly. Nothing we could identify matched the creature or the voices. No bears, no mountain lions, no known animals made sounds like that or moved like that on all fours but with long arms. There were no locals who mentioned anything similar. Whatever it wasn't just some random animal. It was smart, careful, and it knew we were there. We had been lucky. It hadn't come close enough to attack, but it watched and stalked. I still think about that night sometimes. It's a strange feeling, knowing something is out there, right beyond the edge of your firelight, watching you with patience. No screams, no chase, just silent stalking in the dark. I've camped a lot since then, in a lot of different places, but I never forgot that feeling, and I never went back to Featherstone Creek. I've been camping since I was in my early 20s, mostly solo. Over the years, I've gotten used to all kinds of noises in the woods. Bears rummaging around at night, raccoons climbing trees, coyotes howling far off, even the occasional drunk guy singing somewhere down the ridge. I don't scare easy anymore. I've camped through storms that tore guy lines clean off the stakes and sent branches slapping the roof of my tent. I've woken up to frost covering my sleeping bag and hiked out with a twisted ankle. I'm not trying to brag. I'm just saying I've got some miles behind me, and usually nothing really gets under my skin anymore. But 2 summers ago, something happened that still comes back to me sometimes when I'm settling down alone in my tent, especially if it's too quiet. It was June 2023, and I was spending a long week camping around the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I'd done the usual loop through Dolly Sods and Spruce Knob, and I was wrapping up with a few nights at a small walk-in site at a place called Pine Hollow Camp, just outside a little town near the North Fork Mountain Trail. It wasn't a fancy spot. Basic amenities, pit toilets, bear lockers, but it was peaceful and had decent access to some of the rock climbing and ridge hiking in the area. I was in my late 20s at the time, still single, still working remote, so I had the luxury of picking up and heading out whenever I wanted. The walk-in sites were tucked into a sloping forest, with pads scattered about 50 to 70 yards apart, depending on the tree cover. I picked a tucked-away one at the far end, where the trail kind of thinned out and ran parallel to a small rocky creek. I liked it because it was farther from the parking area, which meant fewer people wandering by, fewer headlights, and less general noise. When I set up that afternoon, there was only one other site occupied in my area. The guy was maybe 50 yards off to my left, a little uphill from me, across a section of the trail that split at a bend in the trees. His setup caught my eye right away. He was in a hammock rig, but not the cheap kind. It was a well-put-together covered system with a rain fly and mosquito netting, slung between two big hickories, the kind of thing serious backcountry folks use. His bare canister was neatly placed near the base of one tree, and I could see a bundle of climbing ropes and gear neatly wrapped on a stump. I nodded at him in passing when I hiked past to fill up water, and later, I ended up running into him again at the edge of the parking area. He was topping off a Nalgene and eating a gas station sandwich. He looked to be in his 40s, fit, sun-weathered face, strong arms. He mentioned something about working construction up north and taking time off to climb before heading back for a big job. Seemed like a normal enough dude. Friendly, but a little quiet. Not shy, just a little inward. I've known plenty of guys like that in the outdoor world. Independent, practical, and a little distant when you first meet them. Anyway, I didn't think much about it at the time. We each went back to our sites, and I made my usual little fire with fallen sticks, cooked some camp food, and read for a while in my tent. The forest around there gets thick with insects in the summer, and I could hear crickets and frogs starting up around dusk, blending into a steady hum as the sun went down. It was warm, but not too humid, and I remember thinking it was just about a perfect evening. I went to bed around 10 p.m., nothing out of the ordinary. I keep my gear tight and organized. Boot knife near the door, air horn in the mesh pocket, bear spray under the pillow. Not because I expect trouble, but because I like knowing exactly where things are if something ever does happen. I think I had just drifted into that first shallow sleep when I heard it. The first scream. It wasn't close, it was coming from uphill where the guy in the hammock was camped. But it was loud enough to cut through the trees. It was a deep, guttural shout. Not a word or a cry for help. More like an angry, startled yell. Like the sound you'd make if something jumped out at you and you were ready to fight back. I sat up halfway in my sleeping bag, heart thudding a little but not panicked. I waited, listening. Silence. Nothing else followed. I figured maybe he'd had a bad dream or had gotten spooked by something brushing his hammock. Happens. I lay back down and tried to let it go. About 15 minutes later, it came again. This time more drawn out. A strangled, rage-filled shout, like someone fighting in their sleep. Not words, just raw noise. And then silence again. I sat there awake for a while, listening to the wind stir the leaves. I could hear the guy shifting in his hammock after that. The fabric creaked as he rolled or moved. I figured maybe he was awake now, maybe a little embarrassed, but nothing else happened for a while. Then, just after midnight, it started happening every 20 or 30 minutes. Always the same. A burst of violent, angry screaming. Never quite the same as before, but always loud, always primal, and then quiet again. No muttering, no words, just those horrible, choked howls. Sometimes I thought I could hear his fists thump against the side of the hammock, like he was flailing. Other times it was just a sharp bellow, then rustling, then nothing. The forest seemed to hush between the episodes. The crickets would go dead quiet each time, then slowly pick back up again like nothing had happened. My nerves were starting to go raw from the tension of waiting for the next one. I got up at one point and slipped on my boots. I stood outside my tent, just listening. My headlamp was off, and I didn't want to make any sound. The sky was clouded over by then. No moonlight, just darkness and that awful sense of being too alone with a stranger losing his mind 50 yards away. I kept running through scenarios in my head. Was he sick? On something? Did he need help? Should I go check on him? But every time I thought about approaching his setup, I'd remember what kind of guy he was. Tradesman, probably had tools, maybe even a weapon. And I didn't know what the hell was going on with him. What if he woke up swinging? What if I startled him? What if he wasn't asleep at all? So I stayed in my tent. The screaming didn't stop. It wasn't constant, but it was regular enough that I couldn't rest. I lay there wide-eyed, sweat slicking my arms and neck, listening for the next outburst. Every time I thought he might be done, he'd scream again, shattering the fragile quiet like a gunshot. By 3 a.m., I started hearing someone else stirring in the distance. Maybe someone from another site walking down the trail with a flashlight, probably trying to figure out what the hell was going on. They didn't come close to our sites, just paused somewhere near the trail fork, then turned around and left. I don't blame them. I thought about leaving then, but I didn't want to hike that trail in the dark with my pack. I didn't know what animals were around. I figured the safest thing was to wait it out, but it was driving me crazy. At one point around 4:30 a.m., I heard something different, a new sound. It was the zipper on his hammock rainfly, slow, deliberate. I heard his boots hit the dirt and the creak of someone standing up. For a few moments, he was moving around quietly, pacing maybe, or walking a small circle near his hammock. I froze. Every hair on my neck stood on end. I couldn't see anything. My tent was low to the ground and faced away from him. I waited, breathing through my nose, hands near my knife and bear spray. I didn't hear him coming closer, but I didn't like the idea of him being up and walking around in the dark after hours of night terrors. Eventually, I heard the hammock creak again, and then silence. Back inside, maybe. Another scream came at 5:10 a.m. This one was the worst, louder, more violent, like he was being strangled or attacking something in his sleep. It was followed by hard thrashing, like he was fighting the hammock itself. That was it for me. At 5:30, I unzipped my tent, packed everything as fast and quietly as I could, and headed for the trail. The sun wasn't up yet, but there was a faint gray light through the trees. I didn't even stop to eat or filter water. Just got out. I hiked back down to the parking lot with my pack bouncing against my spine, ears ringing from lack of sleep, body wired with adrenaline. I didn't see anyone else on the trail. My car was the only one in the gravel lot besides a white van, which I assumed was his. I didn't bother with coffee. I got in and drove straight out, headed for the highway. Pulled into a rest stop 40 minutes later and finally sat there in silence, letting my brain settle. I don't know what was going on with that guy. Night terrors, PTSD, drugs, mental illness, I couldn't say. I never saw him again. Never got his name. I checked the camp registry online a week later out of curiosity, but it didn't have any identifying info, just generic site numbers. But that night changed something for me. It wasn't just the screaming, it was the not knowing. Not knowing what someone's capable of when they're not fully aware. Not knowing if you're safe even when you're supposed to be. I still camp. I still solo hike. But I avoid shared walk-in campgrounds now. I go deeper into the woods or stay at drive-in spots with rangers on duty. I learned something that night. Sometimes the scariest thing in the forest isn't a bear or a storm. It's the guy 50 yards away in a hammock, screaming his lungs out in the dark. And you never really know why. I went camping alone last September, early in the month. It was the shoulder season, not quite fall yet, but the weather was already starting to shift. More rain, cooler nights, fog in the mornings. I picked a provincial park about 4 hours north of where I live in British Columbia. I'd been there a couple of times before, once with a friend and once alone. It's never busy after summer holidays, especially when the fire bans are on or there's been a streak of bad weather, which there had been this time. That's one of the reasons I chose it. I like quiet when I camp. This time, because of some nearby wildfires that had blown through the region a week or two prior, and a stretch of bad rain afterward, the place was nearly empty. I think there were 4 or 5 other occupied sites when I checked in, and the whole park has close to 100. The site I booked was way at the end, site 43, past a loop that was already pretty isolated. It backed onto the forest, faced a small lake, and was a bit elevated from the road that led to the rest of the campground. I liked the view and the privacy. I don't always like being too close to other people when I'm alone, and at the time I booked it, I hadn't expected the place to be that deserted anyway. When I arrived, the ranger at the little entrance booth said something about keeping an eye on the weather and being bear aware, because they'd had some activity in the area. That was normal talk for BC parks. I'd heard it plenty of times. I nodded, thanked him, and kept driving in. The roads through the campground were gravel and had puddles in the low spots from all the rain. There were red and orange leaves already coming down even though it was still technically summer. The air was damp and smelled like wet earth and cedar. I passed a couple of campers spread out in the main loop. One looked like an older couple with a fifth wheel and some lawn chairs under a tarp. Another was a solo tent camper with a beat-up hatchback. He was 5 sites down from me, parked at Site 38. I gave a small nod when I drove past, and he nodded back. He had a tarp up and a folding chair out but was just standing there, looking off toward the trees. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. By the time I got to my spot, it was already drizzling again. Nothing heavy, just that constant mist that soaks everything slowly. I set up quickly, popped up my tent, ran a tarp overhead, set up my little camping stove and cooler under the hatch of my SUV. I laid out my gear like I always do. Bear spray clipped to my belt when I'm walking around, air horn in the side pouch of my pack, whistle on a lanyard that I hung by the tent door, and my car keys tucked into the mesh pocket inside the tent. That's the habit I've always had, just in case I need to set off the alarm in the middle of the night. That first day was uneventful. I made instant noodles for dinner, sat on a camp stool and read for a couple hours until it got too dark and too wet to stay out. Then I crawled into my tent, zipped everything tight, and listened to the rain hit the fly. It was cold that night, and my sleeping bag felt damp even though the tent was dry inside. I didn't sleep that well. Every noise outside felt sharp. Branches breaking, rain shifting in the trees, a faint creak that might have been wind or something walking on the gravel. But that's normal for solo camping, especially when you're not used to the quiet. The next morning was gray again. Low clouds hung over the lake. I boiled water for coffee and walked the little trail that ran behind my site down to the shore. There were no other people around, just a couple of loons calling across the water. The stillness was beautiful, eerie, peaceful. It was why I liked solo camping. No one to talk to, no obligations. On my way back to the site later in the morning, I saw the guy from Site 38. He was walking the road with a mug in hand, wearing a rain jacket and boots. He nodded again and I nodded back. Just a quick moment, nothing more. He didn't seem threatening. Middle-aged maybe, late 40s or early 50s, with a trimmed beard and a ball cap. Kind of unremarkable. Looked like someone who might work construction or live out of his van part-time. Again, I didn't think anything was off. That day passed slowly. I spent most of it hiking around the trail system on the far side of the park. There were a couple of washed-out sections where water had eroded the track, but nothing dangerous. I didn't see anyone else out there. I got back to camp by late afternoon, made some freeze-dried food, and settled in for another quiet night. That second night was when I noticed things started to feel wrong. It was around 1 a.m. when I woke up. I hadn't heard anything, but I was suddenly alert, the kind of wide awake that doesn't come with grogginess. I lay still, listening. The forest was silent. No wind, no rain, no frogs or bugs. Just stillness. That's what made it feel off. I unzipped the sleeping bag a bit and reached for the mesh pocket where I'd left my keys. They were still there. I clicked the unlock button just once, no beep, just the click to confirm the key fob still worked. I didn't set off the alarm. I didn't want to, not unless I was sure of something. I stayed awake for at least an hour, just listening. A few times I thought I heard something outside. Maybe a step on wet leaves or a breath near the fly, but I couldn't be sure. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer, but I didn't fall back asleep for a long time. The next morning, I checked around the site. No tracks, no sign of anything out of place. The forest was wet and soft, and if anyone had walked near the tent, there should have been footprints. I didn't see any. I chalked it up to nerves. I've had jumpy nights before, and sometimes your mind just tricks you into being scared. Later that day, While walking back from the pit toilet about 100 feet up the road, I saw the guy from Site 38 again. This time he was standing halfway down the slope that leads to the lake. Not on the path, just off in the trees like he'd cut through and was looking at something. I slowed when I saw him, but he didn't move or wave. He just stood there, watching the water or maybe nothing at all. I didn't stop. I just walked back to my site, trying not to overthink it. Maybe he was just exploring. Maybe he liked quiet spots too. Maybe he was just odd. That night, I double-checked everything before bed. I made sure the bear spray was unclipped and ready. I moved the air horn right beside my sleeping bag, and I kept the keys in my hand when I lay down. I zipped the tent tight and made sure the car was locked. I even put the tarp stakes back in the ground so nothing flapped in the wind. At some point after midnight, I heard the crunch. It wasn't loud, just a single step. But it was close, just outside the tent in the gravel near the fire pit. Not an animal. Too heavy, too slow. I held my breath and gripped the keys. Then I heard another step. And another. Not approaching, more like circling. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't even breathe hard. I pressed the panic button on the fob. The car alarm went off instantly, horn blaring, lights flashing. I heard the steps scramble and run. Fast. Wet leaves and broken sticks snapping underfoot. Someone was definitely there. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag, unzipped the tent, and stood up with the bear spray ready. The alarm echoed through the trees for a full minute before I clicked it off. Then I stood in the dark, listening again. Nothing. I never saw him, but I knew it had been a person. The way the steps retreated, fast and chaotic. The way it stopped the moment the alarm went off. An animal wouldn't respond like that. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the car with the doors locked, lights off, engine off, just waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, I packed everything immediately. I didn't make coffee, didn't eat, didn't even fold the tarp properly. Just threw it in the hatch and drove straight to the front gate. The ranger station was empty that early, so I wrote a note and slid it under the door. Just said someone came into my site overnight and I was leaving early. I didn't leave my name. As I pulled past Site 38 on the way out, it was empty. The tarp was gone. No car, no tent, just wet leaves and tire tracks heading out in the other direction. I still don't know what he was doing. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he thought I wouldn't wake up. Maybe he was planning to do something worse. I don't know, but I trust my gut. And that night, it told me I was in danger. I haven't camped solo since. Not because I'm scared of the woods or being alone, but because I saw what it feels like when something isn't right. When a stranger chooses the wrong time to be near you, when someone enters your space in the middle of the night for no reason they can explain. It only takes one encounter like that to change how safe the world feels. And when you're miles from the nearest town with no cell signal, and only your car alarm to break the silence, you realize how thin the line is between solitude and vulnerability. I still carry the bear spray. I still sleep with my keys next to me. But now I only camp where I can see other people, even if I don't want to talk to them. I don't take chances with empty sites anymore. And if I ever hear footsteps outside my tent again, I won't wait to set the alarm. Because I know now it's not always animals in the woods. Sometimes, it's someone looking for a moment when you're asleep and alone and not expecting them. And sometimes you don't get to find out what they wanted, because you were lucky enough to stop it before. I've been camping solo for over a decade now. I started in my early 20s, just car camping on weekends when I needed to get away from the grind of my warehouse job. I'm 31 now. I'm in decent shape. Maybe a little stockier than I used to be, but I still go out a few times a year. Clears my head. For a long time, I thought the biggest threat out there was nature. Bears, dehydration, twisted ankles miles from help. I still bring a med kit, bear spray, satellite beacon, all that stuff. But in the last few years, I've started thinking a lot more about people. I've had some weird interactions. Drunk stumbling into the wrong campsite, a guy who wanted to share a fire and wouldn't take a hint, a group that blasted music until 3 a.m. one night and threw cans into the woods. But nothing that ever really shook me. That changed last fall. This happened in October of 2023 in the Sierra Nevada mountains, somewhere between Stanislaus and El Dorado. I won't name the exact spot, but it was a hike-in site, about 6 miles from the nearest road. I'd been to that area twice before, and both times I barely saw another soul the entire trip. No service, no amenities, just a few old fire rings and the whisper of wind through the trees. I parked at a turnout off the main road, signed in at the trailhead registry, and loaded up. I was doing a 4-day loop, nothing too extreme. I had my stove, hammock, tarp, a .38 snub-nose I kept deep in my pack, bear spray on my hip, and a taser I tucked into my boot. Probably sounds like overkill, but I've had enough close calls to know that just in case becomes wish I had it real fast. The hike in was beautiful, golden leaves, crisp air, that early fall quiet where everything's getting ready to sleep for the winter. I reached my spot by mid-afternoon, set up in a clearing near a small stream, hung my food, started a small fire. Typical stuff. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a freeze-dried meal, listened to some music in my earbuds, and passed out. It was the second day when something changed. I'd gone out early that morning, just walking one of the trails that looped higher up the ridge. It was a clear day, bright sun, long shadows cutting between the pines. I made it to a small overlook, had a snack, took some pictures. Nothing strange. I wasn't in a rush, just enjoying the time alone. When I got back to camp that afternoon, something felt off. You ever walk into a room and know someone's been there, even if everything looks the same? That's what it felt like. My tarp was still staked, my food bag still hanging where I left it, but I had this nagging feeling something wasn't right. I checked everything. Nothing stolen. No footprints that I could see. But my cook pot was in a slightly different spot, only by a foot or two, and the paracord I used to hang my food had been retied. Not by much, but it wasn't how I left it. I told myself maybe I did it differently than I remembered. Maybe a branch fell and someone came by and helped fix it. I wanted to believe that. I really did. I sat by the fire for a while, not really enjoying it anymore. The woods around me, which normally felt like home, started to feel too quiet, too still. I ended up going to bed early, just to shut my brain off. At around 1:30 a.m., I woke up. There were soft footsteps near the fire pit. At first, I thought it was a bear. I stayed quiet, hand on my bear spray, listening. But it didn't sound like an animal. It was too deliberate. Slow steps, crunch, pause, crunch, pause. My tarp was about 15 feet from the fire ring, so I couldn't see who or what it was. I stayed perfectly still, breathing through my nose, trying not to make a sound. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone zipping a bag, my pack. I nearly stopped breathing. I don't know what took over in that moment. Maybe adrenaline, maybe instinct, but I reached slowly for my flashlight and bear spray. I hit the light and sprayed at the same time, aiming in the direction of the noise. The beam caught a figure mid-motion, tall, wearing a hood, maybe 20 feet from me. The spray hit a tree trunk nearby and missed it around. The figure stumbled back and ran, straight into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting with my revolver across my lap, my back against a tree. I kept the fire going and scanned every shadow, every sound. Nothing else happened. When the sun finally came up, I checked my pack. My zipper had been opened halfway. A few things were scattered, but nothing was taken. I packed up and hiked to the next site along my loop, a few miles away. I figured maybe it was a junkie or someone messing around. I told myself they wouldn't follow me, but deep down I wasn't sure. The next spot was more open, less trees, better visibility. I set up again, this time with a camera clipped to a branch facing my camp, and I placed a few small sticks around the perimeter. Simple stuff. I wasn't taking chances. That night was quiet, but the camera caught something. The next morning, I checked the footage. At 3:12 a.m., the same figure from before, tall, hooded, maybe male, stood at the edge of the clearing for 10 minutes just watching. He didn't move. He didn't approach. Just stood there, half in shadow, until he turned and walked back into the woods. I hadn't heard a thing. That was the final straw. I packed everything and made the decision to hike straight back to the car. I skipped the last night of my trip. I was 6 miles from the trailhead, and I made it in under 3 hours. Every snapping twig behind me made my skin crawl. When I reached the car, I found a small pile of pebbles stacked neatly on the hood. Just 4 small stones. That wasn't there when I left. I drove straight to the ranger station and filed a report. I gave them the camera footage, the location, a full written statement. They took it seriously, or at least they acted like it. Said they'd send someone to check the site, maybe set up some trail cams of their own. But I knew nothing would probably come of it. The guy didn't technically break a law. He didn't assault me, didn't steal anything. Just watched. And that somehow made it worse. That whole drive home, I felt like I was being followed. I kept checking my mirrors. I even took a detour through a random neighborhood before pulling into my driveway, just in case. Paranoid? Maybe. But I've learned that paranoia's just what we call it when we don't yet have proof. Back home, I rewatched the footage more than I should have. Zoomed in, tried to get a better look. All I got was that hood and a pale jawline under it. No clear face, no badge, no gear, no reason to be there. I told a few people, my brother, my cousin, but most just said what people always say, glad you're safe. Or, he probably thought you were someone else. Or, next time bring a buddy. Thing is, I've always preferred solo camping. But after that trip, I stopped going for a while. What really gets under my skin is how much worse it could have gone if I hadn't woken up. If I hadn't had spray. If I hadn't been armed. He wasn't trying to take gear. He wasn't homeless or desperate. He was just standing there, watching me sleep. And that wasn't his first time doing it. I know it. About 4 months later, I got a voicemail from a ranger. They said a hiker had found a camp deep in the woods, not far from where I'd been. Just a tarp, some supplies, and a bunch of phone chargers. And in a small box, they found multiple SD cards. They never told me exactly what was on them, just that the person was likely observing hikers and had probably moved on. That was it. No arrest, no face, no name. Since then, I've changed how I camp. I still go solo, but I bring more gear now. I put cameras on both sides of my setup. I sleep light. I register my plans with someone every time. I carry bear spray and a revolver. I don't use earbuds anymore. I keep everything zipped inside the hammock with me. And I always set a perimeter. Always. People love to talk about how freeing the wilderness is, how it's an escape. And it is. But you need to remember it's not always empty out there. Not everyone you pass on the trail is just out for a walk. Some are watching, some are waiting, and some don't want to be seen at all. I still haven't gone back to that part of the Sierras. Probably never will. But I'll tell you this. Next time someone says, nature is healing, or you're more likely to get struck by lightning than attacked by someone while camping, I just smile and nod. Because if you've never woken up to the sound of a stranger unzipping your bag in the pitch-black woods, good. I hope you never do. I wasn't hurt. I made it home. That makes me lucky. But I also know what's out there now, and I'll never forget it. I was 30 when it happened, and I've never looked at camping the same since. It was spring, early April, and still cold at night, but that had never stopped our group. We were all friends, mostly in our late 20s and early 30s, people from nearby towns who had met over the years through hiking clubs, climbing gyms, and trail races. Some of us had been friends since college. Every few weeks, we'd pick a national forest campground. Always remote, always scenic, and meet up for a weekend of hiking, biking, fires, and too much food. That weekend, we chose Tanner Ridge Campground, a spot tucked away in the forest up in northern Georgia, just off a gravel road that snaked through Chattahoochee National Forest. It was one of those places that technically had 10 or 12 sites, but only about 4 of them were usable early in the season due to the overgrown brush and soft ground. We had the whole place to ourselves, no hosts, no running water yet. No one else even drove by the entire weekend. There were 10 of us in total, 3 couples, and 4 of us solo in single tents. We spread out across 4 sites, close enough to feel like we were together, far enough for some privacy. I was there with my husband, Brandon. We brought our big green tent, one of those cabin-style ones that you can actually stand up inside. It was too much for 2 people, really, but we liked the room. We had a queen-sized, double-thick air mattress inside, and we'd brought extra quilts since the temps were dropping into the 30s at night. Our heads were near the mesh-vented windows on either side of the tent, and we'd left the outer flaps half-zipped down for air. Friday night passed quietly, but Saturday was perfect. The sky stayed clear all day, and a few of us hit the trails on mountain bikes while others hiked to a nearby overlook. Dinner was grilled sausages and baked potatoes in foil, followed by too many s'mores and a bottle of whiskey that made the rounds a few times. We turned in around 11 p.m., the fire slowly burning down while the last couple stragglers climbed into their tents. I remember lying there on my back, eyes open in the dark. Brandon was already asleep next to me, breathing loud and uneven. I could hear the others too. Mark in the tent nearest us had a snore that buzzed like a handsaw. Someone else, maybe Holly, had a deep, low rasp that barely stopped between breaths. It was like being stuck in a cave full of sleeping bears. I wasn't scared at that point, just annoyed. I put in my earbuds and tried to drown it out with a podcast, but it didn't help. Eventually, I just laid there in the dark, listening. The only light came from a sliver of moon through the tent mesh. I checked my phone one last time, 1:03 a.m. I remember thinking it was ridiculous how loud everyone was, and that next time I'd bring earplugs and my white noise machine. That's when I heard the footsteps. They weren't close at first. Just a slow, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel, coming from the far side of the campground. The road that circled through the camp was all gravel, and there was no mistaking the sound. This wasn't an animal. It was too rhythmic, too heavy. I froze. I didn't know why. It could have been one of the guys getting up to pee, maybe walking to the edge of the woods, but it didn't sound casual. There was no hesitation. The steps were slow, firm, like someone walking with a purpose. I turned off my phone screen and laid back down, barely breathing. The footsteps kept coming, closer, past the fire pit, then toward our tent. I didn't move. I don't even think I blinked. Brandon was still asleep next to me, his snoring now the only other sound. I listened as the steps crunched directly toward our tent, stopped just outside, and then moved to the back. Then whoever it was knelt down. I know it sounds crazy, but you can tell. The sound changed from full-body footfalls to the subtle rustle of clothing against fabric. And then they exhaled, loud. Through their nose or mouth, I couldn't tell, but it was deliberate, like someone trying to fog a window right next to our tent mesh. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake Brandon. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, to kick him awake, but I couldn't move. My whole body was locked in fear. The breath had been so close, just inches from where my head lay on the mattress. I could feel it in my chest, like the way your stomach drops on a roller coaster. That primitive, gut-deep kind of fear. Then, just like that, the person stood up. I heard the fabric of their pants brush against the tent again. Then the crunch of boots on needles and soil as they walked into the woods behind us. There was a steep hill back there, maybe 30 or 40 degrees, and I heard them climb it slowly, without slipping, without stopping. Eventually, the sound faded. I don't know how long I laid there after that, unmoving. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. I remember trying to wake Brandon, poking him, whispering his name, but he was completely dead to the world. So was everyone else, snoring all around me, life going on like nothing had happened. Somehow I fell asleep. I don't remember how. Morning came slowly. The sun filtered through the trees and cast pale stripes across the tent walls. It was cold. I sat up, still in my sleeping bag, and tried to listen. Birds, wind, no footsteps, no heavy breathing. Brandon woke up groggy and happy. I told him what I'd heard, and he laughed it off, said it was probably a deer or someone in the group going for a late-night walk. But no one admitted to being up, and I knew what I heard. When we stepped outside, I walked immediately to the back of the tent. Right at the base of a stumpy little bush near the mesh window was a deer antler. Just one, pale gray, split at the end. Still had some flesh and hair stuck to the base, like it had been ripped off, not shed. That's when Brandon stopped laughing. None of us are hunters, but we know what a clean antler looks like, and this wasn't it. It had tissue on it. Part of the skull plate, maybe. The bush it sat on wasn't flattened or disturbed. It looked like someone had gently placed it there. I hadn't heard it land or get dropped, and it hadn't been there the night before. I would have seen it, I'm sure of that. We told the rest of the group. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. No headlights on the road, no vehicles. Everyone had slept through the night, and no one had gotten up. Not even to pee. That would have been weird enough, but it wasn't the end of it. One of the guys in our group, Eric, always brought this little audio recorder. He was an audio nerd, liked to collect nature sounds and mix them into music for fun. He'd set the recorder up on a log near the fire ring that night, just to catch some ambient sounds. He didn't even remember it until we were packing up Sunday. He played it back on his laptop when we got home and sent us a clip. You can hear the fire dying down. Then, around 1:15, you can hear the footsteps. They're loud, crunching across the gravel. You can hear the snoring, too, layered behind it. You can even hear my tent's nylon shift slightly, like something brushing against it. But the real weird part came around 4:02 a.m. The clip is short, maybe 2 minutes, but clear. 2 separate voices, if you can call them that, come through the recorder. They're not human voices, not really. Just strange, rhythmic sounds, like syllables strung together, almost melodic but not any language we recognized. Like 2 people trying to imitate speech, but in a way that didn't make any sense. Not animals, not insects, not wind. I've heard enough wildlife to know that. It was something communicating. I don't know how else to describe it. Just chatter between 2 beings, then silence. We shared it with a couple of our other friends who weren't there, including a park ranger we knew. No one could explain it. The ranger said it was probably raccoons or coyotes or wind bouncing off something, but you could tell he didn't believe it, and it didn't explain the footsteps or the antler. We didn't file a report. What would we say? We still camp, most of us, but we don't go back to Tanner Ridge. That was our last trip there. I've never told my parents about it or anyone who'd worry. They'd ask too many questions. They'd tell me it was a dream or sleep paralysis. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. I wasn't asleep. Someone or something came into our camp that night. It watched us. It breathed on my tent. And it left a piece of a dead animal like some kind of message. And whatever it was, it didn't care that we were there. We weren't a threat. We weren't even a curiosity. We were just part of the woods that weekend. Just noise to walk past. Just things that slept while something else watched. That's what still gets me. We were completely surrounded by people. Friends, bodies, humans, but when it mattered, I was completely alone. No one else even woke up. So I stay alert now. Always. I keep a knife and bear spray within reach, even when it seems ridiculous. I pick campgrounds with more foot traffic. I don't zip my flaps all the way down anymore. And I never, ever ignore footsteps in the night. By someone who's camped alone more times than felt smart asterisk. I don't like to be around people when I camp. That's not a personality thing. I like people okay. Just not when I'm trying to sleep outside in a thin nylon tent that barely keeps out wind or rain or anything with teeth. Being queer and visibly feminine, while not exactly identifying as a woman, puts me at a fun intersection, socially. Especially out in the woods where the rules are different. Especially alone. Especially in winter. Winter camping's kind of my secret weapon though. Nobody's around. Campgrounds are cheap, quiet, often half closed. Most folks don't want to freeze at night or wake up to pee through 5 layers of clothing and a zipper. I don't mind that part. What I do mind is noise at night that I didn't cause. Footsteps, snapping branches, zippers that aren't mine. So I do what I can. Lock up anything valuable in my car. Dirty my gear on purpose sometimes. Put my phone in a scratched up case with a missing corner. I don't want anyone thinking I've got anything worth taking. I keep my phone and car key stuff deep inside my pillow. Flashlights stay nearby, one with 3,000 lumens and a few blinking settings. And yeah, I've got a damn air horn. a big red one. Keep it right by my head in the tent. This trip was early January 2023, just south of the Adirondacks. A state campground, nothing fancy, closed for the season technically, but still reservable if you knew where to look. That was a Thursday night. I took Friday off work to make it a long weekend. Figured I'd hike Friday, maybe snowshoe Saturday, and drive back Sunday before noon. There was some snow, but not deep. Cold, though. Mid-20s in the day, teens or lower at night. Ice in the dirt, even under the dry patches. You can feel that in your bones after a while. My spot was close to the road, near a small wooden office. The main gate was open because of nearby trail access. No electricity in the site, but close enough to the office that I figured it was good. It had 2 other campers registered for the whole weekend, but neither was nearby. The first night, Thursday, was uneventful. I got there mid-afternoon, set up, and made a loop around the grounds. I saw one RV parked maybe 4 sites down, no movement inside. I tapped on the metal door with the back of my glove. Just a quick, hello, no answer. Left it alone. Didn't see another soul. Good. I like that. I ate some of the soup I heated on my tiny stove. Crawled into my sleeping bag early with a podcast playing in one ear. I keep the other ear open always. Not for wildlife, for people. It was a rough sleep, but that's normal. Between cold and wind and my bladder acting like I'm 90, I was in and out. Around 1 a.m., I sat up thinking I heard walking outside. Not footsteps, exactly. Something crunching light snow or frozen leaves. But it was faint, and I didn't hear it again. Could have been a branch. Could have been me dreaming. I didn't get out to check. Just held the air horn, counted to 300, and eventually let go. Morning came like it always does, with no big news. I stretched, walked over to the pit toilet, made oatmeal. I hiked for a few hours, kept it casual, no more than 6 miles. Saw one guy and a dog near the trailhead, a pretty far walk from my camp. He didn't look twice at me, and I liked that. Friday night, I added a second tarp to block the wind, even though there wasn't much. Just wanted to feel more enclosed. I had this weird tension in my back I couldn't shake. Could have been nothing. Could have been leftover nerves from the night before. Sometimes when it's too quiet, your brain decides to make its own noise. That night, I put my bat next to the sleeping pad, inside the tent. Garage sale Louisville Slugger, dented and scarred. Seen better days. But it's metal, not wood, and it's solid. Never had to use it, but I always kept it close. I also put fresh batteries in the flashlight. The big one with 3 brightness settings and a strobe mode that could practically land planes. Everything else was the same. Air horn next to the pillow. Car key and phone stuffed inside it. My boots were placed backwards near the entrance flap, just in case anyone looked and assumed the tent was empty. I don't know if that trick works, but I do it anyway. It was around 12:45 a.m. Friday night when I woke up because something was off. I can't say what it was that time. Not a sound, not a motion, just one of those still moments that made the skin behind my ears feel like it was being pulled. I sat up slow, reached for the flashlight, but didn't turn it on. My tent fabric moved slightly on the far side, like a breeze, but no wind had come through. Not like that. I leaned slightly, stared hard at that curve of nylon, and then fast 2 steps. Crunch, crunch, heavy ones. Not a deer, not a fox, not even a person trying to be quiet. Someone. I froze. My hand closed on the air horn. No voice, no words, just this pressure on the front of my skull, like my brain didn't know what the plan was supposed to be. Another crunch. Closer. That's when I hit it, the air horn. It blasted through the tent walls like a siren on fire. My whole hand shook. I didn't let up until the can hissed. I held still after that. Still didn't use the flashlight. Still didn't speak. I listened. Silence. Then, running. Away. Not fast. Not panic fast. But steady. Like someone who didn't want to be seen but wasn't in a hurry. I waited 3 minutes before I moved. My knees trembled. I grabbed the flashlight, flipped it on, and unzipped the tent with one hand, bat in the other. I scanned everything, right, left, road, trees, across the pit toilet, over toward the RV. Nothing. No prints either. The light snow from earlier had stopped by evening, but it had been enough to keep the ground soft. Still, I saw nothing. Either they walked off the trail or they waited somewhere dry. That's when I noticed something missing. The tarp. The windblock tarp I added was gone. Cut clean across the bottom line, string still dangling from the stakes. I didn't like that. I walked the perimeter once, wide arc, big flashlight sweeping. I tried not to think. I kept the bat in hand the whole time. When I circled back, I saw the tarp, folded, sitting next to the fire ring, like someone left it there, on purpose. I stood in front of it for too long. Then I picked it up, stuffed it in the car, and climbed inside too. Locked the doors, slept curled up with my sleeping bag in the back seat. Not comfortable, but warm, and locked. Morning came, and I pretended everything was fine for a bit. Got out, made instant coffee, sat on a stump. No signs of anyone, no new cars, no movement in the RV. I didn't see any footprints by the road, either. But I did notice something else later, small, smooth impressions in the soil near the rear of my sight. Not prints exactly, just compression spots where something solid had been placed down and picked up again. Could have been anything, but one of them was inside my boot print from the day before. Someone had been there, stood there. I didn't leave that day. That was the worst part. I told myself I'd stick it out, see if it was just one incident. Could have been a hunter, lost. Could have been a kid messing around. But I kept the air horn in my coat pocket and slept in the car again Saturday night. No footsteps came back. No tarp moved. No more silence that felt like noise. But I still felt watched. I left Sunday morning early. I didn't pack slow like usual. I shoved the tent into the back seat still half open. Didn't roll the sleeping pad, didn't fold the chair. I just got everything in and locked the doors. As I drove out past the office, I saw something I hadn't seen before. On the wooden rail outside the door, duct tape. Several long strips wrapped around the top post. Nothing weird about duct tape usually, but it looked recent, fresh, silver against weathered wood. When I got home later that afternoon, I zoomed in on the photos I took from that trip. One from Thursday when I first arrived. In that shot, the railing was clean. No tape. Someone added it after I arrived. It wasn't from the park. It wasn't for repair. It was probably used to seal something shut. A door. A mouth. I don't camp there anymore. In fact, I don't camp within 50 miles of that park now. I still camp in winter. Still solo. But now I park with the front of my car pointed out. I keep the air horn, bat, and flashlight all in reach. And sometimes, if the night feels wrong, I don't sleep in the tent at all. It was early October 2004, and I was 30 at the time, living in Albuquerque. My ex and I had decided to take a weekend trip out to the desert for some peace and time away. Back then, we were trying to patch things up in our relationship. It wasn't going great, but I thought maybe a camping trip could help. Just some open air, quiet nights, and long walks through those incredible sandstone canyons. We drove up to a popular national monument in northeastern Arizona. It was a long drive from the city, with that familiar slow fade from the green-brown New Mexico hills to the deep reds and oranges of canyon country. You start to feel it as soon as you pass Gallup and drop into the high desert, wider skies, sharper shadows, that raw, wind-blown feeling that never really leaves the rocks out there. The campground we picked wasn't remote. That was important to me. I used to do solo backcountry hikes, but after a few run-ins with creeps in the past, I'd stopped doing the isolated stuff. This place was basic, but it had picnic tables, a couple vault toilets, and maybe 30 or 40 spots spread out in a long curve along the canyon edge. The place wasn't empty either. That Friday night, there were families setting up RVs, older couples in tent trailers, some solo folks with small cars and lightweight setups like ours. You could hear people chatting, kids yelling, camp stoves hissing, just the usual campground sounds. We pulled into a spot a little past the middle of the loop. A tree gave us partial shade, and there was a view of the canyon rim maybe 20 yards away. We had one of those ultralight backpacking tents, just a net top and thin floor with a rainfly if you needed it. That night was clear, so we left the fly off and just slept under the stars. We cooked pasta on a small burner, watched the sun go down behind the cliffs, and sat for a bit after dark drinking lukewarm beer from the cooler. I remember staring up at the stars. It was one of those classic desert skies, the Milky Way clear and sharp like someone had spilled milk across black velvet. Eventually, we climbed into the tent and settled in. He fell asleep pretty fast. I lay there for a long time just listening. The campground still had activity. People laughing, radios playing low in the distance. It wasn't late yet, maybe 9:30 or 10. But slowly, the voices thinned out and the lights dimmed, one campsite at a time. That's when I heard something. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. Just the sound of someone walking, soft steps on the gravel road that looped through the sites. At first I figured it was a person going to the bathroom. Then I thought it might be a deer. They're common around there, and I'd seen a few earlier that evening grazing in the bushes beyond the campsites. The sound got closer. Crunch, crunch. Pause. Crunch. Then silence. I opened my eyes and tried not to move. The tent's mesh top was clear, and even with just starlight, I could see outlines. Trees. The silhouettes of cars and tents. No one had turned on any lights. I scanned the area slowly, feeling more curious than scared. Then something or someone moved right past the tent, just a few feet away. It was close, so close that I heard the dry leaves shift under their weight. The sound of deliberate steps, not animal steps. Someone walking slow and careful. I waited. No voices, no flashlight, nothing. Maybe it was just a camper cutting between sites, I told myself. But then it stopped, right next to our tent. They didn't move for a while. I lay there frozen, my breath shallow. My heart started beating louder than I expected. There was this odd stillness, like everything around us, the whole campground, had quieted down at once. I turned my head slowly and looked up through the mesh roof. Someone was standing over the tent. He was just a few feet away, and I could see his silhouette against the stars. His head was tilted down like he was looking directly at me, not moving, just staring. I was stunned. Then I said, probably louder than I meant to, "Hey!" He turned and walked away immediately, not running, just walking quickly like he'd been caught doing something and wanted to get clear. I shot upright, grabbed my clothes, and shook my partner awake. He barely reacted. I told him someone had come right up to the tent and looked in. He just mumbled something and rolled back over. I pulled on my pants and fleece jacket and stepped out barefoot, scanning the area. Nothing but shadows and silent tents. I couldn't tell where the guy had gone. I didn't feel safe. The tent had no barrier, no lock, no walls. It was a net, a screen. I walked over to the car, unlocked it, and got in. I sat behind the wheel and kept watch. The keys were in my coat pocket. My adrenaline was still going full tilt. My eyes scanned every shadow. Every shape in the darkness looked like it might move. After maybe 20 minutes, I thought I saw someone again, back behind our site. Just movement, something shifting in the brush behind a tree. There wasn't much light, just the faint spill from other campsites and the stars overhead. I couldn't make out a face or shape, just a suggestion of motion. I leaned forward and stared. Nothing. I kept watching. Time passed slowly. I felt like I was the only one awake in the entire loop. Then, from the road, someone walked past the car. As they passed my window, they turned their head and shined a flashlight directly into my face. It wasn't a casual glance. The beam hit my eyes dead on. I flinched and raised a hand, blinking. Then the light clicked off, and the man kept walking like nothing had happened. I sat there frozen. It wasn't some ranger doing rounds. It wasn't someone looking for the toilet. This felt targeted, like whoever it was had known I was in the car and wanted me to see them seeing me. That was it. I threw the door open and yelled for my partner. I told him we were leaving. He groaned and dragged himself up, annoyed, but I didn't care. I shoved things into the car without packing. Tent, bags, cooler, everything just dumped into the back. He was still trying to argue when I started the engine. We drove out of the campground and didn't stop until we were clear of the park. I didn't know what time it was, probably after midnight, but I kept going until we hit the outskirts of a small town. There was a Howard Johnson there. I pulled into the lot and parked under one of the yellow street lamps. We tried to call the local rangers. I couldn't get a clear answer. Tribal police weren't helpful. One of the numbers rang forever. The other gave us some canned response about how there wasn't much they could do unless someone had actually done something. We didn't book a room. We just sat in the car in the motel lot, slumped in our seats, the doors locked and windows barely cracked. I tried to close my eyes, but every time I heard a noise, I jolted upright. Eventually, I gave up. We left again a little after 4 a.m. and started driving north. It was still dark, and the roads were empty. At one point, we pulled over on the side of the highway near Monument Valley to stretch our legs and breathe. And that's when it happened. The sky started to shift from black to deep blue. The full moon was hanging low over the horizon, pale and heavy. The sun started to come up behind us, casting gold light over the rock formations. Massive stone spires lit up with color like they were glowing from within. That early light, the silence, the chill in the air, it was perfect. No cars, no voices, just us and the desert. I stood there for a long time, not speaking, just breathing and watching. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. That image stayed with me. Sun rising in the east, full moon dropping behind the cliffs in the west. The fear from the night before still sat heavy in my chest, but this moment felt like something pure, like the land was reminding me it wasn't to blame for what happened. We never figured out who the man was or what he wanted. Maybe it was someone unstable, maybe just some creep trying to scare people, or maybe worse. I'll never know. We drove back home that afternoon without speaking much. My partner acted like I'd overreacted the whole time, but I didn't care anymore. That trip was the start of the end of that relationship. I wanted to feel safe. He wanted to sleep through danger. After that, I stopped camping with other people for a while. I didn't trust anyone to take my instincts seriously, but I didn't stop going outside. I didn't let it ruin the desert for me. I just got smarter about where and how I camped. I stayed in well-lit areas, always had a way out, kept my keys within reach, and didn't rely on anyone else to keep me safe. I still think about that night sometimes. That man standing over the tent, the flashlight in my eyes, the stillness of the campground. But I also think about the quiet road near Monument Valley, the blue shadows stretching across the plateau, the last glow of the moon, the first fire of the sun. There was fear, but there was also beauty. And somehow that morning helped settle the night before. Not erase it, but balance it. And that's how I remember it. Both parts, the danger and the dawn. I was 27 the first time I camped completely alone, more than a mile from any other soul. I'd done some solo car camping before that, parking near popular campgrounds, sometimes even hiking a little way off the main trails. But this trip was different. It was mid-October in northern Utah, a shoulder season for most people, which meant quieter trails, empty campgrounds, and cold, crisp nights. Exactly the kind of peace I was after. My fiancé had asked me not to go completely off-grid, and honestly, I wasn't trying to scare anyone. I kept cell service as long as I could, promised to text every night before bed, and carried everything I thought I might need. I brought my bear spray and my air horn. My fiancé had also gotten me this huge Sikhs-looking knife after a string of weird trail stories started circulating online. It was heavy, over a foot long, and looked like something you'd find in a museum. I didn't have much training with it beyond basic knife handling, but that wasn't really the point. It made me feel better. Sometimes that's enough. And tucked into a quick access pocket on my backpack were my taser knuckles. If you haven't seen them, look them up. They look like brass knuckles with 2 electrical prongs near the knuckle pads. They aren't toys. They hum with this quiet menace when turned on, and they light up blue at the tips. I'd practiced drawing them and using them quickly. Not that I was hoping I'd ever need to, but they gave me more confidence walking into silence. I picked a remote area south of Ogden, a ridgeline that stretched between 2 small lakes, South Ridge. The access road was a steep gravel climb off a 2-lane highway and wound up through aspens and lodgepole pine. There weren't any designated campsites there, which was what I wanted. I parked at the edge of the forestry boundary and hiked in about 3 miles until I found a small flat clearing tucked between 2 massive granite slabs. The view was perfect, blue mountains stacked like folded fabric in the distance, and below me, a tangle of green and gold trees reaching into the valley. The first night went smooth. I made camp slowly, double-checked that my food bag was strung up and out of reach, boiled water for my dehydrated meal, and settled in before sunset. The air was thin and cool, and the quiet out there had a kind of weight to it, the kind that can either calm you or mess with your nerves. For me, it was calming. I sat with my back against a rock, watching the last rays of sun roll across the ridgeline. That night, I didn't sleep great. It wasn't fear. I've just always had trouble sleeping the first night out. The chill was real, and the sleeping pad wasn't doing much to soften the granite under my tent. Around 2 a.m., I heard something crunching leaves outside the tent. I laid still. My hand was already around the grip of the Sikh's knife, which I kept sheathed inside the tent wall. Whatever it was, it didn't linger. I never unzipped the flap. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. The air horn stayed next to me. Just hearing that small movement and doing nothing helped reaffirm something I'd already learned from books like The Gift of Fear. You can recognize tension, acknowledge it, and still let it pass without feeding panic. The second day, I did a long out-and-back hike along the ridge. I didn't see a single person. I heard a couple of birds overhead, startled a rabbit, and took in the silence. I came back late, just before the light dipped low. My little clearing was untouched. Still, something felt a bit off. I brushed it off. That weird, low-lying anxiety that comes from being truly alone can start to morph. I reminded myself of that. I had done this because I needed to feel capable, independent, and free from everything. That second night was worse for sleep. I turned over a dozen times before midnight. The cold had come in hard, and I had pulled my sleeping bag drawstring tight around my face. But around 1:30 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it wasn't leaves. It was snapping, not once but twice, twigs cracking. It was slow, methodical, not the quick, haphazard movement of wildlife. It came from downhill where the trees thickened. I held my breath and listened. No other sounds. I pressed my ear to the tent wall and strained. And then, about 30 seconds later, I heard it again, closer. The same kind of snap, like someone had stepped hard on a dry stick. I slipped the taser knuckles out of the side pocket of my pack, still inside my tent, and put them on. I also grabbed the air horn and set it next to me. My heartbeat sounded louder than anything outside. For minutes, nothing happened. Then a new sound, cloth against cloth, like a jacket brushing tree bark. It sent a chill through me, and then it stopped. I waited. My legs cramped. My shoulders ached from tension. I didn't move for at least 20 minutes. Still nothing. I didn't open the tent. I didn't make a sound. I finally drifted into a light, shallow sleep just before dawn. When I unzipped my tent that morning, the air was painfully cold. My boots were damp with frost. I forced myself to step outside to check things out. I didn't see anything immediately alarming, but something was different. The dirt around the west side of my tent had fresh indentations. Someone had walked there. Not animal prints. I've seen those. These were boots. Not heavy ones, more like light trail shoes, and they'd come in from the trees, stopped near the rock edge, and then turned around. That was the moment I knew with complete certainty. Someone had been watching me. The fear didn't hit immediately. Instead, it was this cold, clinical kind of realization. The wind cut hard through my jacket as I followed the prints a few feet down the slope. Then they veered off into thicker woods and disappeared. My phone still had one bar. I texted my fiancé, "I think someone was near my camp last night. I'm packing up now." He responded right away, "Just get somewhere safe. Text when you're down." I moved fast. I packed in a kind of quiet panic, checking over my shoulder every 2 minutes. Every stick crack made me twitch. I kept the air horn clipped to my chest and the taser knuckles on one hand the entire time I broke camp. By 10 a.m., I was halfway back down the trail toward my car. That's when I saw it. Just off the trail, about 10 feet into the trees, there was something propped against a log. It was a plastic bag. Too clean to be trash, too deliberate to be random. I shouldn't have stopped, but I did. I walked closer, keeping my knife in my hand, and peered inside. There was a sweatshirt, blue, balled up, and an empty water bottle. No wallet, no trash, just those two things. Maybe someone ditched it on a hike, but the whole scene felt staged. It made my stomach turn. I didn't stick around to think it through. I jogged the last half-mile back to my car, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. Once I got to a gas station 15 miles down the highway, I sat in the parking lot and just breathed. I messaged my fiancé and then my dad. I didn't cry, I didn't shake, but I knew I was rattled. That night, I didn't sleep much at home either. Not from fear of someone outside, but because my brain wouldn't stop going over the possibilities. Someone had followed me up there. Maybe they'd seen me from a distance and waited until dark to creep in. Maybe they were just curious. But who wanders silently through the woods at 1:30 in the morning and stops 20 feet from a solo camper's tent without saying a word, and leaves no trace but a few footprints? Over the next few days, I went through everything that happened. I retraced it all in my head, and what stuck with me wasn't the potential danger, but how quietly it had all unfolded. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no threats, just the creeping sense that I'd been watched, that I hadn't been as alone as I thought. I reported it to the local forest ranger office, just to be safe. They didn't have any open cases that matched, but they took my notes seriously. I gave them coordinates and photos of the prints. The guy on the phone thanked me, said it was good I'd gotten out and that it was smart I'd kept my family informed. That trip didn't stop me from solo camping again, but it changed the way I approached it. I started reading more about how people pick up on subtle signs of danger. The gift of fear became something I reread now and then, not out of obsession, but to keep those instincts sharp. I practiced with my self-defense gear more often. I stopped second-guessing my gut feelings. Sometimes people talk about fear like it's a weakness, but I think of it like a boundary line. It's not there to trap me. It's there to guide me, to say, that's far enough. Trust your instinct. Step back now. The truth is, I still love the silence of the woods. I love waking up to light pouring through the trees and the sound of wind rolling over leaves. But I don't pretend I'm not vulnerable anymore. I just accept it and I prepare. That's how I keep doing what I love, even when it means stepping alone into the trees. I never found out who was out there that night. Maybe I never will, but I know what I felt was real, and that's enough.